Welcome to the archive, Kathleen Marden. How are you doing today?
Doing well, thanks.
All right. It's good to see you again. I'm used to seeing you speak at the Exeter UFO Festival. I'm also used to seeing you on TV. So you are the leading expert on the very famous Betty and Barney Hill incident. You are also heavily involved with MUFON.
Yes.
And I mean, let's get started with Betty and Barney Hill. So to you, when you were growing up, they were your aunt and uncle.
Yes.
Um, and so did you grow up around here in the Portsmouth area back in the 60s?
I was born in Portsmouth, but I grew up in Kingston, New Hampshire, across the street from my grandparents' farm. And that's where Betty grew up.
Wow. Okay. Betty grew up on a farm. I wasn't expecting to hear that. Um, so what was it like in Kingston growing up at that time and seeing Betty and Barney?
Well, I think it was probably one of the best places in the world to grow up because it was safe. You never had to lock your doors. Um, People were honest, and it was nice to have my grandparents across the street, uh, to interact with them on a daily basis. They were very kind individuals, and it's nice to be a kid and to be loved by so many people. I had an aunt and uncle who lived beside my grandparents' house too, and they had a small farm. They had dairy cows. They raised chickens, broilers, and they also had a huge vegetable garden. And my grandmother uh, sold gladiolas as well.
All right. All right. So you were able to get fresh milk,
We
gladiolas.
could get fresh pasteurized milk, from across the street, cream, chicken, eggs. We had just, a very small version of what my grandparents had right in my backyard as well. And we always had our own garden there. But I really enjoyed helping my grandfather plow the field and driving the tractor and that sort of thing. I wasn't so fond of pulling weeds, but it was something that we did.
All right. Was not expecting that kind of answer, but um, but
But it
I
was
can imagine.
nice.
Yeah.
I had a great relationship with my classmates at the Daniel J. Bakey School, where I went through grades 1 through 8. And I was a tomboy, you might say. That I guess girls accept that kind of behavior today, but I enjoyed running with the boys and climbing trees and doing acrobats and all sorts of things like that. I didn't really enjoy some of the activities that girls were forced to do, like jumping rope and playing with little girly games. But I did have a doll that I used to strap to my body when I would climb trees. Um, so I always had that as well. And when I rode my bicycle, I graduated from the 8th grade and went to Sanborn Seminary, as it was called in those days. It was right across the street from Bakey. And I was on the student council there for 3 years, very active in the school, as I had been in elementary school as well. I was studying college prep and really enjoyed my time there. I was a good student and I loved research essentially. Betty and Barney were very good role models, and they took an interest in the work that I was doing in my grades. They took me places when they would travel, as well as my grandparents did. and some aunt and uncles. So I really had an opportunity to see the world, to go to things that a lot of kids didn't do in those days. And so it was just an idyllic childhood.
Wow. Yeah, it does sound like an idyllic childhood. So nowadays when we talk about travel, since you mentioned that, a lot of people think like, going to other countries, road trips across this one. Was it very much like that that you were doing, or was it a little different at that time because of the way transportation was set up?
It was different. Travel in those days was travel from Kingston, New Hampshire to Arcadia National Park, or to Lake Champlain, or to Niagara Falls. Betty and Barney took me to Lyndon Johnson's inauguration, where the three of us actually received an invitation
Oh,
to go
wow.
because of our work when I was a teenager in politics. So, and of course, Betty and Barney were actively involved in the political scene in New Hampshire.
Wow. Okay. So what was the political scene like, especially with their activities?
Well, Barney was involved in the NAACP, for one thing. He was legal redress on the regional board. I have read that at one time he was the local director of the NAACP. I didn't know that, but I've read it. So I'm not positive that it's accurate. He and Betty set up the Rockingham County Community Action Program with a group of other people from the community. And Barney was the chairman of the committee that set that up. So he ended up actually receiving an award from Sergeant Shriver, who was the head of the U.S. Poverty Program, for the work that he had done. So it was basically Barney that was getting the recognition, but Betty was right there by his side. They were extremely active and involved in the community and in the state. Barney set up a literacy program through the Archdiocese of Manchester, New Hampshire. And I have the award certificate he received for that. And of course, we needed a literacy program in those days so that people could learn to read, so they could pass the literacy test in order to be able to vote.
Wow.
So that was another important thing that Barney did. And I remember looking up to him. I was so proud of the things that he was doing to help the community, to help the less fortunate.
Mhm. And so when you were talking about things like the literacy program, so literacy that was a big problem that at that point.
It's my understanding that there was a literacy problem in New Hampshire. Yes.
Okay. Wow. All right. So Bart wow, so they definitely were some very active members within the community. It's interesting, and all this is new stuff for me. I've
You
never.
know, in those days, we didn't recognize dyslexia. We didn't recognize learning disorders. And those children were thought to be just bad students, punished for not being able to pay attention, failed, staying back, and they'd drop out of school oftentimes after the eighth grade.
Hmm.
Fortunately, since then, we've realized that these are intelligent kids who would be well behaved if we recognize that they had this learning disability and we could accommodate them.
Wow. And so was that also, so I'm gonna guess that was also tied in a lot with Betty's work too, because she worked a lot with kids.
She did. She was a child welfare worker and an adoption worker.
Wow. Option, man.
Mhm.
She's got a set of people skills I don't know if I'll ever have. But
She did have a great set of people skills. Everyone
yeah.
loved her, except for the disinformants. They didn't like her.
um So from my understanding also, so aside from the politics in work, so Betty was a lifelong career in social work,
That's
and
correct.
Barney had lifelong work and as a mailman, and he was also like a postmaster as
He
well.
wasn't a postmaster.
No, he was
No,
not.
no, he was a mail delivery person.
Okay. All right. Um, and it's also kind of interesting researching on mail delivery at the time because that was seen as very high regard in the community.
Yes,
People trusted.
that's true.
Yeah.
Yes, it was a respected position. It paid well. It had great benefits. So it was a good job.
Yeah.
And Barney had been in the Army, joined just before World War II, and he was wounded during the war. He ended up recovering, of course, and veterans were preferred for positions in the post office. So when he lived in Philadelphia, joined the post office as a mail truck delivery person, and then transferred up to New Hampshire after he married Betty.
Okay. And so I am curious, was Barney, so Barney was injured during the war. There was from my understanding, there was some sort of incident with a hand grenade, and in end result, he had dentures because of it.
That's correct. He had scars on his chest as well.
Okay. Um, did was Barney ever? A lot of people did go into World War II and came back affected to some degree. There's a couple of really interesting documentaries, like Let There Be Light. Was he ever affected by his experience in World War II at all?
Not that I'm aware of. It's not in any of the records that I have.
Okay.
Um, I suspect that his fatal cerebral hemorrhage could have been related to the percussion accident that he had. The reason I believe that is I have a friend who's a medical doctor who was a physician over in Iraq during the war. And he ended up having a stroke because he was in an explosion over there and it weakened the vein in his head. And so there's a possibility that that is what caused Barney's early demise.
Okay.
He was only 46 when he died.
Yeah. Okay. Wow, that sounds to me, I had always heard from other people saying it was stress from after the incident that had brought him an early demise. But that's interesting to hear that it could have been related to that injury.
Well, the stress, I think, probably added to it. And he had high blood pressure
Okay.
as well.
Okay. All right. So all right, so they had a very interesting they were in terms of their political career or involved with politics in the area.
Mhm.
Close family. You looked up to them. They
Mhm.
were heavily involved, and they were both very hardworking people.
They
Um,
were.
yeah, and so they get married, and their honeymoon on the way back at Franconia Notch. That is where the incident happened. From my understanding, it was they saw something, they stopped to take a look at it. Eventually, it flew over them when they got back in the car. They didn't remember it at first, and then later on, it eventually got to a point to where after talking to enough people, they went and saw a hypnotherapist, Dr. Simon. Uh,
Okay, let me clarify the facts in that. First of all, it wasn't their honeymoon. They'd taken a honeymoon. They were married a year and a half when this event happened in 1961. I had been to Niagara Falls with my aunt and uncle, a different one, uh, earlier in that summer. And I had photographs of my trip, and I was showing them to Betty and Barney during a weekly visit when they would come to visit with the family. And Barney turned to Betty and said, "Have you ever been to Niagara Falls?" And she said, "No." He said, "Well, do you think you'd like to go there sometime?" And she said she would like to go. So he decided that he was going to surprise her in September with this trip to Niagara Falls. So it was a multi-day trip, and they had an enjoyable time. And when they were returning home at night, they'd gone up to Toronto, then spent the night, gone on to Montreal.
After hearing from a number of different perspectives, to me kind of got confusing. Some people have said that she, like Betty and Barney, wanted to dismiss it right away. Some people have said Betty and Barney went over to Betty's sister, your mother's, the next day.
Okay. I'll tell you what happened. Well, first of all, Barney had to stop the car. He looked up at the craft through binoculars. He described it as a huge pancake, just hanging there silently above him. He stepped away from the car, and when he did, the craft shifted to an adjacent field and descended even lower. It was now about 100 feet in the air and about 50 feet in the distance. So this is when he put the binoculars up to his eyes, and he saw what he described as figures wearing black shiny uniforms that were somehow not human.
Mm-hmm.
And he continued to watch them. And from the action he was watching and the fact that something started to drop down out of the bottom of the craft and little fin-like structures started to come out from the sides of the craft, he became terrified. He pulled the binoculars from his eyes so forcefully that he broke the strap, and he went screaming back to the car to Betty that they had to get out of there or they were going to be captured. Thus the name of my book. And so got back into the car, and as he was getting into the car, the craft moved back in his direction. He'd left the car running and the door open. So Betty did get a good view of the craft at that point. She saw it before he stepped out of the car, but because of the interior lights were on. He closed the door, got in, went speeding down the highway. And this is when he and Betty heard a series of code-like buzzing sounds striking the trunk of the car. It caused the car to vibrate, and a tingling sensation passed through Betty's and Barney's bodies. The next day, when they were at home, they went out to the trunk of the car, out to the car, and saw new shiny spots that hadn't been there the day before. Betty called my mother that afternoon, and we had a neighbor who was a physicist. And my mother called our neighbor, and he said, "Well, tell Betty if she has a compass, take the compass out to the vehicle and see what the needle does." Well, when she went and put it over those spots, the needle whirled, indicating a magnetic field in the area where they heard those buzzing sounds. See, there's a lot of evidence, related evidence here, that people aren't necessarily aware of. All of my information came from the archival record. I wanted accurate information from the Air Force files, from the NICAP files. And of course, I had my own memory because I saw those spots a couple of days after the incident occurred, when my parents, my two brothers, and I drove to Betty's and Barney's house.
Okay. All right. So what was your memory of going there and seeing that?
Well, when we went to the house, Barney was seated in the living room. In one part, it was a very large living room, in one part of the living room, and my father talked quietly with him. Betty told us children not to bother Barney that day, that Barney was contemplative, pensive. He was normally gregarious and laughing and smiling. He was completely different that day. He was distressed. And he also was waiting for a call from Pease Air Force Base. He sat, my father later told me that Barney sat and told him about seeing those figures on that craft as he was standing in that field looking through binoculars. And it's also in the early reports that Barney described these figures who were looking down at him. Betty had her watch, and my memory is correct, and I think it is because this had such a big impact on me. You don't forget things like this. Her watch was laying on the table, and she picked it up and she handed it to me. And she said, "See if you can get this to work." Her watch was broken, so was Barney's. Their watches never ran again. I have that watch, and it says 5:16 a.m. So Betty and Barney were supposed to arrive home at 2 or 3 in the morning. When they arrived home, the watches were broken, but Betty didn't know that. So she looked at the clock and she set her watch to the time that the clock in her living room said. So, and it's still there, 5:16 a.m. is when she did this. Betty told us a little bit. We were very interested in what she saw. So she talked to us about that, and then she took us out to the car and we looked at the spots on the trunk of the vehicle, shiny spots, all the same size.
What color were they compared to the rest of the car?
They were the same color. They were just shiny. The rest of the car surface was duller. These were highly polished.
So what happened preceding this? Did they talk to? Did you ever talk with them further about it? Did they try to figure it out? Did they record things?
We talked over and over again. Barney was different. He wanted to forget about the whole thing. It was just so distressing to him that he wanted to push it aside and forget about it. But Betty, whenever she would come down to visit, that was once a week at least, she was extraordinarily curious and wanted to learn all that she could about these things. And so we saw Betty and her conversations with us as she was looking for information. And then we saw Barney not come into the house immediately because he was walking the back lands of my grandparents' farm. And then he would come into the house toward the end and sit down and talk with us. But he really did not want Betty's information. It was like all it was going to do is just cause him to become more deeply distressed. And sometimes he would become angry with her. Just stop talking about it. Forget about it, Betty. That sort of thing. But of course, she was highly curious. She couldn't forget about it.
Yeah. Did you inherit some of that curiosity?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm very curious. That is why I have done such an extensive amount of research and investigation on this case over the past, right now, it's 33 years.
So you made a book with Stanton Teed Freeman about it at one point.
Yes, I had been writing that book since the early 1990s. And my husband and I did our own investigation too. We took the trip that Betty and Barney took, stopping at the stops that they made. And I have to tell you, one of the disinformants claimed that Betty and Barney had been driving something like 16 hours before they had the sighting, and that they must have been hallucinating. Well, first of all, maybe 16 hours on the whole trip, but that was a multi-day trip. So he was lying. And then my husband and I were at least 20 years older than Betty and Barney at that time that we took that trip, and we weren't hallucinating. So, I just wanted to cover all bases. I wanted to take all of the skeptics and disinformants arguments, and I wanted to test them to see if they were correct. Maybe they were. I wanted to be as unbiased as possible. But I had my own memories, of course, but I took all of that information that the Hills had and tested it. And, the thing that bothers me most is that some of these so-called skeptics who were really disinformants ended up disseminating false information. And that false information was widely propagated through the media. And this has led to a great deal of confusion and misunderstanding about what occurred regarding the Hills.
Mm-hmm. So when you say disinformants, was this the only thing that kind of comes to mind is sort of like the Condon Committee, where it was a committee, Condon wanted to just shut the whole UFO thing down with the government research. Was it people like him that were being disinformative, or?
Well, Ed Condon didn't have that much involvement. It was more Philip Klass. And Philip Klass was the most prolific anti-UFO disinformant of the 20th century. He was a writer. He'd been an electrical engineer. He had his bachelor's degree in that. And then he went to work as a writer for Aviation Weekly, which ended up being Aviation and Space Technology Weekly magazine out of Washington, D.C. Philip Klass, I've done an investigation on him, and I have his FBI file. And he had gotten himself into trouble with the federal government. In fact, he was being followed. His apartment was searched. He was under suspicion as being a spy, giving government secrets to the Eastern European bloc. And so when he was in all of this trouble, and I forgot to say that in the magazine, he published government secrets, classified information twice too. The only reason they couldn't take him to court is they would have to declassify the documents. So anyway, when this sort of thing happened and someone is in deep trouble, they can be coerced by the government to act as an intelligence agent or a disinformant in order to clear their name and not have to face more serious consequences. So Phil Klass's history, and I've been to his archive as well, his history causes me to believe that he was working for the government in order to suppress UFO information and to create this very noisy disinformation campaign against individuals who were credible and had credible UFO related cases. He did it over and over again.
Mhm.
Also, Dr. Donald Menzel, who was an astrophysicist at Harvard University, Stanton Friedman discovered, was also an intelligence agent for the NSA. He had been involved in naval intelligence for a very long time. He was very closely connected to the federal government, had a lot of government funding and that sort of thing. So he was very loyal to the government. And he was another individual who, beginning back in the early 1950s, started to invent possible explanations for what might have occurred, weather explanations, temperature inversions, that sort of thing, or just simply making statements against a case without ever having investigated it. So if you look at his history, you'll see that his statements were rather ignorant, but here is a man who's brilliant, he has his doctorate, he's an astrophysicist, but he's making these statements that are, he's a lot smarter than that.
Yeah.
Let me put it that way.
Yeah. like the swamp gas claim.
Oh yeah, those swamp gas claims, that was a disinformation as well.
Yeah. So I'm curious also, because you've been in MUFON and you've been researching phenomenon for a long time. How is it going from during the time when this was a fringe topic to now there's public hearings? Government has a department that does public hearings.
Yes, it has been quite an extraordinary journey. I joined MUFON in 1991 because I wanted to train as a field investigator to investigate Betty's and Barney's case myself. I had had the opportunity to observe some of the early investigators, such as Alan Hynek, such as Dr. Jacques Vallée, and many others, people who had been in NICAP, people doing investigations, Dr. James Harder from APRO. And I admired their work. And so from an early age, I thought about possibly doing this in the future. So in 1991, I joined the Mutual UFO Network. I trained and worked my way through the ranks. I was a field investigator, a state section director in New Hampshire. Then I went on to become the national director of field investigator training. And then I was, for 10 years, beginning in 2011, I founded the experiencer resource team, is what it's called now, and managed that team, was director of that team for 10 years before I stepped down because I had other commitments. But I'm still a consultant and I'm on the team.
Yeah. Wow. Does it, is there some kind of reward or relief brought that now it's something that you've done your whole life and there's such a big public acceptance?
Yes. I know that the government is being very cautious and the military isn't really in favor of the investigations that are being done now, but it's great that we're having another congressional investigation. We had congressional investigations years ago. They didn't really go anywhere. But it's nice to see that they're doing this again. And I know that the Defense Intelligence Agency has had programs for many years where they are actually sending their scientists out into the field to do this research and investigation. And they've come up with a lot of great information that's been released through the Freedom of Information Act or just directly to the public. So I've been very pleased with what the Defense Intelligence Agency has done to date. But every year when funding comes, it's becoming more and more amorphous. They have taken out the term, I guess I think they used to use UFO, but it's now anomalous phenomena.
Mm-hmm. Anomalous phenomenon.
Yeah.
Okay. Anomalous phenomenon. All right, I'll have to try and remember that term.
So I guess that can cover everything. They've been out to the Skinwalker Ranch in Utah and studied what they believe are the interdimensional portals where things are coming through, such as prehistoric animals, such as non-human entities, such as poltergeist activity, orbs, all sorts of things come through. Some of the scientists have taken home attachments to their homes and passed it on to their families and neighbors, that sort of thing. So I find that extraordinarily interesting.
Yeah. And I'm curious too. So you've been involved, you're a consultant for the experiencers and you were director of that for one point at MUFON. I'm very curious because I keep being told that during the time, in the 50s and the 60s and into the 70s, it was a time you didn't talk about this kind of stuff, and you just didn't talk about maybe what you might have been going on, maybe what internally might have been going on. And from someone who experienced with what you experienced with Betty and Barney, and now there's literally a department where people can show up and say, hey, I think I've experienced something. What has that experience been like? Have you seen this bring in like a new, or kind of in a new era for people to be able to open up about things that have had a big impact on them?
Yeah, well, I think initially, back in January of 1953, the Robertson panel met, and the CIA and government scientists to try to determine what stance they ought to take on this. And that's when they decided to officially launch this cover-up and to use scientists to think of prosaic explanations. Anything would work. They were told to use logical deduction rather than scientific investigation, and to dismiss this and to ridicule those who had these experiences. And that created this aura in the United States, at least, of individuals who believed that anyone who claimed they had seen a UFO was a nut or an attention seeker or a liar, just a person who was problematic. And so, it's a big step to overcome those attitudes. Now, those people who knew Betty and Barney believed them for the most part, but those who didn't know them received a lot of disinformation, misinformation about who they were and about what they saw. So that was really difficult to see my close family members being disrespected, dishonored, lied about. And when things began to change, I breathed a sigh of relief. When I was young, I didn't tell people about Betty and Barney, about their experience. I might have whispered it to some close friend, but if I was going to advance in my career development, I had to be careful. In fact, I knew about Betty's and Barney's experience for years before it was made public as the result of a violation of confidentiality. We were sworn to secrecy. And so I lived a lot of my life in secret. And then I finally worked quietly on this investigation for years. And when Stanton Friedman agreed to join me in 2005 in writing this book, where I wanted him to write about the star map, he said, "Don't be an apologist ufologist." And, you know, that was a really one of his sayings that I absolutely loved. Stand your ground. If you know that something is right, stand up for it. Don't be embarrassed because somebody is misinformed or somebody doesn't want this information released. Be factual, back up everything you say with the facts, with the documented evidence that you can show. And he helped me a great deal to move beyond that uncomfortable feeling that I had. And of course, he had a huge persona and a loud voice, and he was known around the world for the work that he did. He was a nuclear physicist. And so he was highly respected, even though he wasn't respected by the disinformants that he called debunkers. So anyway, I noticed, probably 10 years ago, that the television shows had changed. Prior to then, there were shows about UFOs, but they would always bring out one of these debunkers to give false information at the end. And those debunkers called it balancing the show. I don't call it balancing when you have documented evidence, true information, and then you bring out a liar. But that's what they called it. And so I was happy to see that they were no longer bringing out people to give false information. And that went on for quite a long time. And this is, and then finally the government in December 16, 2017, had released some of this information to the New York Times through Lou Elizondo from the Defense Intelligence Agency. And that made me very, very happy that videos of real craft that could outfly and outmaneuver anything we had, and that had properties that we didn't have in any country on this planet. That made me feel very happy that finally this was going to become scientifically respectable. It should have been a long, long time before that, rather than simply being dismissed. I think the government was just saying, well, there's nothing we can do about it, so let's just hide it so that, and ridicule the people who see these things. But maybe we've advanced technologically enough so that there are government scientists who are willing to look at this. The government is appropriating funding for it. And the highly experienced military pilots who saw, and radar personnel who saw these craft are coming forward and have been for some time now. And so that was, I felt very optimistic when I saw this occurring. I thought, finally, the truth can be told.
Awesome. Thank you, Kathleen. Is there anything you'd like to share with future generations as a final question?
Uh, I want to just tell future generations not to be fearful of these entities. They've been here for probably thousands of years. They came back when we were detonating nuclear weapons. They're extraordinarily concerned by our use of nuclear weapons and our failure to be good stewards to our environment. They're concerned about an environmental collapse on our planet. So it's according to what thousands of experiencers of contact have told me, those who have communicated or been shown videos or images on craft. This is the message that they're bringing back to humanity. And these entities do not want to interfere too much. They don't want to enslave us. They don't want to conquer us. They're gently attempting to guide us in our development. That is what I have taken away, and that I believe are the most important things to pass on to others.
All right. Thank you.
My pleasure.